Recently, I was rereading Willie Russell's Blood Brothers. Now, of course, this work is kind of the standard thing that you would read if you were doing GCSE English, especially in the UK. And I'm sure many of us don't have very fond memories of doing so, but without a doubt, one of the things which is very important to take away from this work is the plight of lower class peoples, especially within industrial societies, and in particular in the context of, let's say, the 1800s and the early 1900s, when working conditions and worker rights were not so focused upon. Now, of course, industrial societies are not completely bad. There are without a doubt many good things about them, and industrial societies have brought about a greater quality and standard of life for most people across the globe. However, there are significant disadvantages and weaknesses of an industrial society as well, and one of them is the alienation of workers and the quite dehumanizing nature of their work, especially for the lower classes. Now, I'm not a Marxist, but Karl Marx and his kin do have a very valid point when they talk about the alienation of man from the product of his labor in society and how that develops resentment and anger. You see, in many pre modern societies, and I'm not defending these pre modern societies because they had their own issues, but one of the things, without a doubt, which was quite good about pre modern societies and especially the nature of work is you were typically connected to the product of your labor, and also the environment within which you were working was a very humanizing kind of environment. So, for example, if you're a farmer, you're obviously connected to the product of your labor. You know, you're producing this kind of grain and food that your community needs to survive with. And obviously, as a farmer, you're working with other farmers, you're working with animals, you're in nature. Or, for example, if you're a craftsman, you're producing your kind of crafted items, and it gives you a great sense of pride that you're able to produce such things, and you're engaging with your customers. You most likely have a family business. The same thing can be said about, let's say, weaponsmiths or any other occupation. But when it comes to, for example, in modern industrial societies, if especially if you're like a lower class wage slave kind of worker, you're producing a very small part of the final product, so you're alienated from the product. But not only that, you're like in this kind of factory or this very unnatural, unorganic setting, which is not very conducive to leading a kind of fulfilling day-to-day life. And over time, that obviously leads to resentment and anger. And so, especially for the lower classes in many modern industrial societies, there's a great plight, there's a great suffering that they face. Perhaps maybe not simply so on a merely socio-economic level, but also on a psychological and a spiritual level. The best way to describe it, obviously, is how in the third world, many workers are employed for very, very little salaries. In a similar case, the kind of suffering that they face mirrors the suffering of many of the lower classes who are forced to work by circumstance in these kinds of factories in Western countries in like, let's say, the 1800s and the early 1900s. Now, of course, we can't abandon industrial societies, and we can't abandon the benefits that industrial societies give us, such as higher productivity, higher efficiency, but we can attempt to modify these downsides. Of course, the conditions of modern industrial societies have significantly changed, but many of the same criticisms still hold true. For example, in contemporary society, let's say you're an office worker, then you're in quite a, let's say, alienating, dehumanizing environment in terms of being stuck in an office all day, not connected to nature or your society, and it's not a very organic form of work, and you're very much disconnected from the larger picture, from the larger work of your organization. You're simply contributing a very small piece to it. And oftentimes the work you're doing is just for the sake of the company in and of itself. It's not because of the final product that is being produced. And hence that can be quite alienating and somewhat dehumanizing, and that leads to anger and resentment, especially if you're dependent upon your job for a salary, but your salary isn't that much at all anyways, especially in contrast to the price of living. Now, of course, managers and CEOs and people who are employers ought to try and focus and improve the working conditions as well as, the incentives to work and also the work environments. But, of course, we can't simply abandon industrial societies. And this isn't to say that industrial societies, like I've said before, aren't good. I mean, overall, I would say there's a net positive benefit to being in an industrial society, but these are quite significant weaknesses of modern industrial societies, and they are things which have to be addressed quite significantly.